Building Men is brought to you by Finish the Race Apparel, FTRapparel.com, the creators of all things building men, and by Become Stronger Industries, become-stronger.com, the creators of handmade steel maces, hammers, and other badass equipment.
They have to figure out who they are. I think there are a lot of people out there, and this is another way where I've been very lucky and very blessed to be able to be an individual. Now, that's caused issues because being generic is easier, and being generic will quote unquote sell, but you might not be happy being generic. And I don't think anyone is actually truly generic. I think sometimes people will dumb themselves down or dilute themselves in order to be that way. I think the first thing you have to do is figure out who the heck you are, and then you can figure everything else out. Do I have the right people around me? Do I have the right spouse? Do I have the right friends? Do I have the right job? Do I have the right coworkers? Everything. You can evaluate everything else, but you can't evaluate any of that until you know yourself first.
You're listening to the Building Men podcast with Dennis and Anthony Miralda, brothers on a mission
to help you become the strongest version of yourself, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and physically.
What is up, everyone? Welcome back to the Building Men podcast. As always, I am your host, Dennis Miralda. I am joined today by the host of the best show ever, Philly Talk Show. More importantly, though, he was the coach of the Bright Yellow team in the Bordentown Area Basketball League in 2015, and he coached my son, Denny Miralda. Tyrone Johnson, what's up, my man?
What's going on? Thanks for having me. How are you?
I am good. Thanks for doing this. I've been following along on your journey. It's funny, after you coach my son, and definitely one of the best coaches he has had in all of his years playing sports. There was something about the way that you coached I really enjoyed. And then I flip on the TV 2 years later, and I see you with Mike Missinelli, and I said, dude, Tyrone is on TV. I had no idea. So it's been pretty cool watching your journey. So I'm going to start with this, Tyrone. As I mentioned, you were my son's basketball coach growing up, and you've coached youth sports, and you've also been involved with watching a lot of coaches on the college and the professional level. So in your opinion, what are the qualities that makes up a good coach? What do you think?
For me, number one, it's consistency. And then also being able to kind of give respect if you expect to get respect. And I think that's something that carries over from kids all the way through to the NFL or the NBA, NHL, etc. The bully coach can kind of work with kids, but not for too long. And it doesn't work at all with adults anymore. Maybe it used to. And I know there's people out there, that's what you want, that fire and brimstone and yelling all the time. People tune you out. They don't want to hear that stuff all the time. And I'm not saying it's never appropriate to yell, but if you're doing it all the time, they're going to tune you out. And the other part is that cliche of you should lead like you like to be led. I think really, really applies. Like, it has to be true to yourself. And sometimes people go into a coaching profession, and that's why something like Joe Judge with the Giants, he's got the grown men running wind sprints and coaches running wind sprints. And I knew at that moment, this isn't going to work, because you're treating them like kids. These are adults. And I think and I just think that that's the biggest mistake. People who aren't comfortable with their own skin, and then it's exposed to everyone else that they're not comfortable in their own skin. And I think that's what ends up jamming up coaches at every level more than anything else.
Absolutely. It's funny you brought up Joe Judge. You work in Philly, and so it's Eagles, it's Sixers, it's Flyers. That's basically everything with what you're about. And I'm a big New York guy. We talked about this before. Mm-hmm. I'm a New York guy, and so the Joe Judge thing resonates with me, which is why I think Dable has been successful. He's still he holds people accountable. But he's also like, I'm also going to respect that you are grown men, that I'll hold you accountable, but I also recognize that you need to put in your work on the outside as well.
And you got to hold yourself accountable. Yeah. And if you're just bullying everybody, you've created a situation where no one can ever say anything back to you. So you'll never hold yourself accountable, ever. And then eventually people will realize that and say, well, why should I listen to you when you were messing up and you couldn't own it yourself?
Was there a coach that you emulated? It could have either been that you had growing up, or a professional coach that as you were coaching these young men that you're like, I want to be like this guy or that guy?
There was a football coach when I was coming up in high school, Pete Tate. Mr. Tate, Coach Tate was really good. He had to take over from a legend. Pete McEnany had won so much at Penn Saucon and won state titles. He's really the only coach there that had really won. And he was on his staff, and then he takes over. in the mid 90s. And it was actually for two reasons. Number one, that first year, when he took over as the head coach, we were practicing too much. And I can say that comfortably because the following year, we didn't practice nearly as much. It was too much. And he thought that more was more. And then he made an adjustment on the fly, recognizing that with certain situations, less was more. Like we were prepared, we were accountable, we were working hard. And there was times when we'd get done school and we're still there at 6 o'clock. Like we're not learning anything at this point. We're just tired. We're just beat up. And he made an adjustment on the fly and admitted like what I was doing wasn't working. And a lot of these losses we were having that year were because of me. And he admitted that. And he was able to make that adjustment and realize that one, it should be somewhat fun. Even on a professional level, it should be fun. Like anybody out there, regardless of your job, you do it better if you're enjoying it.
Absolutely.
You just do. You just do better at it when you enjoy it. And he recognized that. And while I'm not saying he would never yell, he didn't make that his default because that wasn't really his personality. He was actually a nice guy. And it's okay for a nice guy to act like a nice guy. You don't have to be a jerk just because suddenly you have a coaching title. Now I have to be a jerk. And and I thought always, if I ever coach, I'll just be myself and then try to make adjustments based on the kids or whatever around me, but just be myself and enter it. And then if you make a mistake, you make a mistake. And if you do it right, well, see, this worked. And at the end of the day, you also can't play for players. And that's one thing, like the best thing you have is have good players. Like any coach will look smarter if they have a bunch of good players. And that's actually a way I think where coaches can actually stay humble because you're only as good as your players at the end of the day at every level. Well, I'm drawing up stuff. Yeah, but if you have an awesome kid, well, that kid will execute it better because he's really good. Like there's no substitution for players. You can't play for them. So at some point also you have to then trust other people because you can't go out and run the play. You can only call the play. So he was the biggest one.
Phil Jackson he was a great coach, but it didn't hurt that he had Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and Shaq and Kobe on his team for all those years. It's funny you mentioned that Coach Tate having to make the adjustment. Again, mentioned it as a Giants fan. I remember in 2007, 2008 timeframe with Tom Coughlin as the Giants coach. He was this tough disciplinarian, if you were 5 minutes early, you were 5 minutes late to a meeting under Coughlin. But Strahan, Tiki Barber had conversations with him like, listen, we get it, but you got to get out of your own way as well. And what was cool with you being my son's coach was you didn't have a kid on the team. You did it. You were giving back to the community. You were giving back. You led by example. And you also, the parents you kept them at an arm's distance, which was a really positive thing because at that age group, every dad knows exactly what should be done. They know how the game should be called. You did a nice job of managing the parental piece of it as well, which I just credit to you.
No, I appreciate that. That part's so tough. And I hate this because it happens all the time. Not really with the parents from that group. There was nobody like crazy. But a lot of times you see parents ruining the experience for the kids. Baseball is the one where it's the most noticeable because it's the slowest game. And you go to these youth baseball games and guys are working the umpire. The guy's getting paid $50. Leave him alone. Like, I'm not saying he didn't get a call wrong, but what do you think he's out here actually rigging the game against your son? And it's just like, oh, my son's batting sixth, he should be batting fourth and all that kind of stuff. At least with basketball, I will say, which made it easier, is it happens quickly. So as long as there's not a bunch of whistles, the parent might be mad, but the things could still be happening. That, oh, my son's not doing this. Why didn't you do that? He might have just got a basket by the time you get trying to talk about why you were upset. Like, just let the game play out.
Exactly.
Let them play, because that's really what it was about. And the only reason I did it, honestly, because I heard that it was short on coaches. And I was, at the time I was working mornings, so I had just time in the evenings. So I was like, all right, well, yeah, I'll help out. That was really the only reason. It was just like, all right, you need help? Sure, this will be fun.
Absolutely. And it's funny too, because with parents of those players, and I'm playing baseball in high school and in college, I totally get that. And every dad growing up playing Little League thinks that they know exactly how it needs to be done at all times. But for parents, I would tell them, it's not about you. What you're experiencing, if your kid scores a basket, let them be. It doesn't mean that you're a better dad because your kid hit a double against the best pitcher in the league. It means that they put in the time and the effort. So take us back. You grew up in Pennsauken. Take us back. Your experience growing up, and one of the things you talked about was you're 12 years old. Your dad got you a set of weights, and you and your brother in the basement training, lifting weights. There was an old AM radio that you plugged in, and it pops on Sports Talk. And that was the moment for you that you're just like, wait a second. people can talk about sports and get paid for it. This could be someone's basically profession. So take us back. What was going on in your mind during that time?
Yeah, it's a weird thing. And I remember this. The weird thing about that story is, it's a good thing where, like, if you tell the truth, you never have to worry about it. The first time anybody ever did a article on me was 2004. And just as a quick aside, and somebody sent me recently that article, and I talked about this story even then, even back then.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we had got, it was I know it was during the week because we had to shovel snow that morning because you got to go make money. It snowed.
Yeah.
Go out there and try to go hustle and make some money. We were all done at that point. Everybody had either said yes or no at that point. So we go into the basement, and we had just gotten that weight set. And the radio was in the house from the previous owner of the house. So it had been there already. I had moved there when we were in like second grade. So we had been in the house 4 or 5 years at that point, and no one had ever touched this radio. It was just there from the previous owner. I plug it in, and it was AM only. Old one. It's still in my parents' basement. My mom's passed, but my dad, it's still in the basement right now, that radio. I plug it in, and we're just like, does this work? And literally sports talk radio comes on. And we're sitting there going, what are they talking? And it was, I guess they were talking about the Eagles off season.
Okay.
At the time, I remember them talking about the Eagles off season, even though it wasn't football season because of the snow. It was, the Eagles were already out. They were talking about the Eagles off season. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, people do this? Because my dad was listening to oldies pretty much all the time.
Yeah.
WDAS, that was what he was listening to, and that was that for the most part. So he didn't really listen to any kind of talk radio. I was like, this is a thing. And literally from that moment, that's the only thing I ever wanted to do.
Thank God it wasn't like the Jackson 5 on when you plugged it in. You might be dancing on stage somewhere. That was the case, right?
Yeah,
so
it was crazy.
You mentioned, Tyrone, 2004, because that was a big year for you. And you talked too about, there was a guy, you applied for a job, or there was something like that. And there was a guy that basically told you at that time, listen, thank you, but, and fill in the blanks of the story, thank you, but listen, as a black guy, the way that you are, you're going to scare the white people. They're not going to listen to you, right? Yeah. Something like that happened in your past at that time, right?
Yeah, that was the first time that it happened. It ended up happening a couple times. I started young. I'm in college. The very station I was listening to, this is now 8 years. Yeah, so I was 12 years. This is 8 years later. I start working there. I've been working there for like 4 years. And I'm like, I had moved up, but I kind of felt like I'd hit the ceiling. And the boss at the time, who's now passed away, used to say, basically, you get this job to do something else. So then I'm thinking, well, I shouldn't have to leave. This is home. I should be able to do something else here. And I started mentioning it, and that particular boss was not the one who said it. It was a different person that was on the air, and the assistant program director at the time, the person below the boss who had that edict. Mike Garofalo, for example, people out there that worked for NFL Network, he was working with me at that time. He got that same speech I got, just in a different way. Then he goes and works for the Newark Star Ledger, and now he works for NFL Network. But they were just told him to leave and come back, basically. They were told me I would scare white people, and therefore I had no future doing that. So then I had to leave. I applied for a new job like that week, and I left and went to New Jersey 101.5 from there because of that, because I'm like, I'm not going to be able to change that person's mind.
Right.
There's just no way.
And what a different, Jersey 101.5, I remember growing up working for my father. We would listen to like Howard Stern in the morning and then put on like Mike and the Mad Dog in the afternoon, and every once in a while 101.5, but it wasn't a sports talk station. So it was not synonymous with what you wanted to do. But growing up, Tyrone, you mentioned what you saw in the media, what you saw, you turn on ESPN, things like that. There were the white guys that were the announcers, and then there were the black guys that were former athletes. And you're like, wait a second, I didn't play at a pro level. How can I get to this point? So there was this identity shift that you needed to go through, thinking like, I need to be able to break through this glass ceiling right now as someone who didn't play, at a professional level, but I do the research. I know what I'm talking about. I have a really strong opinion about these things. So what was that like going through that? Was there someone that helped you along your journey, a mentor, a coach, or were you just like, no, I'm going to do this myself?
There were no mentors that looked like me, because they didn't exist. There were mentors, though. There absolutely were. Throughout the time, there were situations where the host all liked to work with me, and the bosses didn't like me at all. That's kind of the case still to this day in a lot of ways. Like, if I look back, most of the people I've worked with over the last 22 years, the coworkers all have liked me. and maybe one boss along the way. And the weird part was, and what happened was there's this subtlety there because people don't necessarily see it. So what happens is if you're a regular viewer or you're a regular listener, you'll hear the Caucasian guy and the black guy. And you'll go, okay, not recognizing that Caucasian guy, they come from all different walks of life. They could have been a sports writer. They could have just entered a contest. They could have been doing production and somebody thought they were clever and then gave them a shot on the air. And unanimously on the sports side, every person pretty much was always a pro athlete. So I was like, now think about this.
Yeah.
Like in NBA right now, there's like 400 players. So think about all the humans that play basketball. The best 400 on earth. You must come from that pool in order to get on the radio. But if you're a white person, you can literally come from anywhere. And I was like, well, that right there is the issue right there. It's not that it should be easy for me because it's still hard. It's not easy for white guys to make it in a major market and get a show. It's not easy. What I mean is there's an actual path. The only path at that point in the business outside of even Stephen A. Smith wasn't on the radio then. He was writing for the Inquirer and got a TV job. He actually only got his radio job because of his TV job. Like if you look around the country right now, there are very few black people on the radio who didn't play pro sports first. And meanwhile, the white guys, it's still hard. I want to make that very clear. I'm not saying it's just easy, but they're coming from this very diverse background. Some of them wrote about sports, but not all of them. Some of them did a podcast. Some of them did this, that, and the other thing, and all these different things. Meanwhile, there's one path this way, and it's almost impossible. Like that didn't seem right to me. And that was the hardest thing to overcome because at times people wouldn't even get it. Well, what do you do? He's black. I was like, yes, but the only reason you're respecting him is because he had to be one of the 0.1 of 1%. Right. Meanwhile, this other guy was just a guy. Not saying he wasn't talented, but as far as his resume goes, he's just a guy. He was a guy who liked sports, and you were willing to give him a shot, and then he did the most with it. Well, what about giving someone the shot who didn't become from the 0.1%? And that was the hardest part.
Yeah. He's like, it was like the Mike Greenberg, who now like RG3 is sitting next to him. And the reason RG3 is there is because he got drafted number 2 overall by the Skins back in the day, right? So going through your experience and what we like to do in Building Men is I love to hear about the journeys that you had growing up and how it shaped the man that you are today. So growing up, what was a lesson that you learned in that middle high school age range? It could have been, you mentioned Coach Tate at Penn Stalking, that helped you become who you are today. What's a lesson that you learned during that time that really stuck with you?
You know, it was about not putting I have to give credit to Mr. Snyder. He was my chemistry teacher in high school. He's currently the athletic director at Penn Stalking High School now, still to this day. And it was really more in high school. In middle school, I did pretty well in school. And I started to notice, though, along the way that my brain sort of worked different. You don't know that when you're like 8. Right. You're just like you're just going to school or whatever. Then you start going through puberty, you start doing stuff, and you start to be more independent just naturally. You start to pull away from your parents a little bit. And I know you've had to deal with that. Yeah. But it's just all of a sudden, it's like, I don't want to hear that, Dad, and stuff like that. And you're starting to realize that, like, when you're having those conversations in class or things like that, that like my brain was working differently than other people's. I'm not saying better or worse. I'm only saying different. So I'm like, I remember that I got pushed into this science-based situation in school. And what I mean by pushed in is that I was doing well and I was getting encouraged by teachers to take these more challenging courses at the time in high school. So I remember it actually ended up saving me a ton of money in school. We can get that in just one moment. But I remember that Mr. Snyder was like, well, just because you want to do this doesn't mean you can't also be good at that. And I was trying to think, like, I was starting to think, you know what? I want to be good at everything. Now, the reason that was somewhat different is because other kids, while we're still in high school, their dreams are still making the NBA, making the NFL, doing all that stuff. I already knew, like, I didn't necessarily have to do that because I wanted to be on the radio talking about the NFL and talking about. So already that was like a subtle difference. When some kids are talking about, like, I'm going to make the NBA, I'm going to go to this school, I'm thinking, all right, what do I have to do to be able to talk about people that are in the NBA? But the reason the science thing was important was I remember I had bio and chemistry at the same time. Then as a junior, I had bio 2 and chemistry 2, which I got college credit for at the same time. And they messed up my schedule where it's like a rule in the state that you're supposed to have lunch 5 days a week. But gym class was more important for me so I can have a bit of an outlet.
Yeah.
So my labs ended up basically the labs would take you out of gym 1 day a week. Somehow my schedule got messed up and I came out of lunch 2 days a week. And I still had gym 5 days a week. And I just didn't say anything. And people were like, what are you doing? Like, I was like, no, right now for me, gym is more important than lunch. And I remember right there, Mr. Snyder was like, why are you doing this? You really shouldn't do that. And technically he could have said something because it's kind of not allowed. And instead he just was like, you know what, you're passionate enough about it. If you need to leave to go grab food real fast and come back up, I'll let you. Yeah. Because clearly he knew that I was like pushing myself in this weird way. Still to this day, I knew exactly what I wanted to do at 12. Why am I doing this at 16? It was like one of these things where it was just like, I think I can do it. I'm being encouraged that I can do it. Let me see if I can pull this off as a junior in high school, if I can pull this off. And I did. And I remember thinking like, all right, now this is good. And I was like kind of the first case where I was kind of proving people wrong.
Yeah.
And I figured, and that to me, I think is what helped me be able to try to prove people wrong later on. Because in my mind, I had already done it. A lot of this might have been created in my own mind. There were people who said, you're crazy, you shouldn't be doing this, blah, 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 even then. And I think that's what helped me stick to it. Because I was like, if I was able to do this, and I was still playing sports and stuff, and then I ate breakfast and then found a way to find just food and then taking all these labs and doing all this stuff. And to the point where I remember when I was in those classes, there was a student teacher who ended up leaving because she thought the material she was teaching was too tough. And meanwhile, I had to do two of them at the same time at that point. So I was thinking, you know what, if I prove people wrong this time, I can do it again later on. And that was big for me.
Love it. And that teacher, Snyder, you said his last name was?
Mr. Snyder, yeah.
He likely could have gotten reprimanded by knowing that you didn't have a lunch, because it was like, you need to make sure that kids get at least a half-hour lunch every single day as part of whatever the state is saying. Mm-hmm. But he recognized like bending the rules a little bit there for you was way more important than following them to a T, the black and white part of the rules. Well, you brought up your voice and being able to challenge the system a little bit. And I'm wondering, when was the first time that you remember, and I'll use this as an example, you went after Barkley. You were talking to Charles Barkley when Ben Simmons was still on the team. And you were talking to Barkley about the number of threes that Embiid is shooting. Charles Barkley and Shaquille O'Neal are on, and they're talking, he takes too many threes, he should be in the post. And you push back. And you're like, he's only taking 3 a game. He needs to clear out some space for Simmons to be able to do what he needs to do because he can't shoot worth a shit. So let's talk about this. And here's this all-time great basketball player, on the dream team. He was this guy. You're sitting across from him and you're going after him, and you basically shut him down with your research and how you came after him. And I loved watching. I sent it to everybody. I'm like, I'm talking to Tyrone today. And this was one of the moments that I thought was really cool. Can you remember the moment where you kind of stepped out of your shell a bit, that there's a guy in front of you that you're talking to that you could have idolized or revered, and you're going after him in a way?
It's funny. So some of that comes from my dad. I have to give him a lot of credit, where the way he would always talk to my brother and I, especially, my sister some too, but my brother and I especially, because I'm the oldest. My brother's 2 years younger than my sister's 2 years younger than him, was like everybody was the same. Like, and even though he was like an old school tough dad, it was like you can question everybody but me. Like, don't question me, but you can kind of question everybody else. And I remember playing PYA football. Wilbert Montgomery came, former Eagle. He had when they were on the Super Bowl team with Jaworski, he was the running back. Up until Westbrook and Shady McCoy, he was the best running back in franchise history. He comes to the practice, and I remember because one of the parents was tight with him. So he comes to the practice and he starts signing stuff. And he signed a pair of rib pads. And I remember the next day for practice, I just wore the rib pads. Like, other people were like taking the stuff and they're putting it aside and stuff. I was like, I still need rib pads. In my mind, I was just like, wow, that was important. I was like, so this was like, I guess I was like 10, 11, somewhere in there is where it first started, was like, and my dad's telling me that everybody's the same. Then you have to kind of treat people like everybody's the same and not idolize too many people. And my dad used to really drill that into me, like to not idolize people but so much. Now I recognize with age, as I get older, that like maybe that was realistic for me. That was actually not really realistic for a lot of kids. Plus, I was also blessed enough to have both parents and have at that point 4 grandparents.
Right.
So like I'm solid uncles. Like I have a really solid family system, uncles, everybody. So I kind of don't need to go outside the family to find that thing. But I know a lot of kids aren't in that particular place. And for that reason, I realized that maybe what my dad was saying wasn't necessarily realistic for the world, but it was super realistic for me. Like I didn't need to go outside. I didn't need Wilbert Montgomery to let me know that I was good, bad, or whatever when it came. So when it fast forwards, you just treat people like people. And some people don't like that because they're used to that. Barkley doesn't care. To the point where I could text Barkley right now. He'll get back to me in like 6 hours, but he'll text me back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And to me, it showed one, when you're aspiring to be the top in your profession. And I definitely think that I love listening to you because one, the way that you present, you do your research, but also you're not afraid to have those tough conversations where a lot of people in the spot are placating whoever the guest is because they're in awe of how good they are in that capacity. So I appreciate that. You mentioned Westbrook, you mentioned Shady McCoy. And again, as a Giants fan, these are guys that I couldn't stand during the time, like a Deshaun Jackson for running back the punt against Matt Dodge but there are those guys that you hear about, and they're Philly guys. Like they embody that mindset, the grittiness of the city. I think back, like in my history, Barkley is one of those guys, Mike Schmidt, Lenny Dykstra, Brian Dawkins, like those kind of guys. When you think back on growing up and even your experience now, who are the guys you say, like, these guys embody what it means to be a Philly athlete?
It's funny. So the guy, B-Dawk is as obviously an obvious one. Barkley was the biggest for me because he was an individual and you got to know him. So the reason, for example, like I gravitated more to Jimmy Rollins and Ryan Howard than Chase Utley was, Utley never said anything. Utley was a really good player. I'm not saying he was excellent. You can make the argument he was the best of the 3. To some, he was. But Jimmy Rollins was the one who said, we're the team to beat. So then they win the division in 07 and they win the World Series in 08. That all started because Jimmy Rollins was willing to stick his neck out. He was a big one for me. Dawkins also did it on the field, but I've always been into the guys that would talk. I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense. But then back it up because I think that like there are always people, regardless, like even when you started doing your podcast, you start doing that. They may not have said it to you, but there were people out there who absolutely said, I hope he does great. And then I know there was somebody out there silently going, that won't go anywhere. That's not going to succeed. And those people, so I feel like when you're able to speak out that way, that invites all those people to come out. Like, go ahead, show yourself. Like, go ahead, all the doubters. And then you have to go succeed anyway. And while I know that's not a natural personality for everybody, some people are. Dawkins was a quiet leader. Then we find out years later that he was going through depression and possible suicide attempts, and he was trying to set up a way where he could commit suicide and his wife could still get the life insurance. We don't know anything about why that's going on, and that's why he didn't speak but so much at the time. So I always gravitated to the guys who always had the voice and they could back it up. Don't talk if you can't back it up, but those that could talk and back it up, like Reggie Miller when he beat. I hate that because you're a New York guy with the Knicks. When he's doing that to Spike Lee and scoring all those points late, so he's talking it, backing it up. All the eyes are on him, and he does it anyway. Those have always been the guys that I've gravitated to. Like, you kidding me? He put it all out there on the line. Everyone out there, a good chunk of people are rooting for that person to fail, and then he still succeeds. I'm like, are you kidding me?
And he loved the villain role. He was one of those guys. He wanted to be the guy that you hated from the other team. And I think about, what was it, in like 17 seconds he scored like 10 points or something crazy like that against the 90s Knicks teams, which that team, that still breaks my heart. Think about Charles Smith, 1 foot under the basket trying to make a layup when he's 6'11".
Just dunk the ball.
It still hurts me when I think about that. All right, so you mentioned Barkley, Jimmy Rollins, Ryan Howard, those guys. One of the things that Barkley's famous for back in that late 80s, early 90s timeframe was that he would say, I am not a role model. Like he came out and he basically said that. How do you feel about that? Like, if you have people looking up to you, you have kids that are like, I don't see anybody that looks like me that's doing what he's doing. I need to be an athlete. Do you feel that pressure of being a role model for kids that are going through a similar experience that you went through?
Yeah, Barkley was a role model. He was wrong. I liked it when it was happening because I already had that mindset, like, like, you just be yourself and don't worry about it. No, he absolutely is. And to a far, 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 far lesser degree, I am too. I'm the only person in Philly who has gotten this particular opportunity. Only black person. It is what it is. And therefore, any mistake that I make, I'm not talking about you had a bad show, that's human being stuff. Any large thing that I do will make it harder for the next person, a person much more talented, a person who's much better at it than me, who's 10, 20, whatever age they are right now. I'll make it harder for them. And I recognize that. Like if I fail, it will be harder for other people to get the shot. And I know how long it took me to get that shot. So in actuality, he was a role model. I absolutely am. And the thing is, I have to remind myself that like my circumstance, I was still lucky. Like I had bad luck professionally. I had amazing luck with my family, like having everybody, we had a bad stretch with like in 2019, and that one was tough. We can get to that in a second. But for the most part, I've been extremely blessed with having everybody. So I didn't necessarily need that external thing, but I know a lot of people do.
Yeah.
And there are absolutely kids out there that were looking up to Barkley. There are absolutely people that do. And there's not nearly as many looking up to me, but I recognize that there's importance in what I do to certain people, even if it's one. And I have a responsibility to do the best I can for that one person.
Building men of character, integrity, strength, compassion, and empathy through transformational mentoring, coaching, and motivational speaking is our mission here at Building Men. To work with me as a one-on-one life coach, you can find information in the show notes, or you can visit our website at buildingmen.io, where you can book a free 30-minute discovery call to help you become the strongest version of yourself mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and physically. Now, back to the show.
I love that answer, and it's absolutely true with everything you're saying. And I appreciate you saying that about the podcast too, because I'm in the spot where definitely in the beginnings were challenging, but now I'm like, all right, Joe Rogan, I'm coming. Just give me some time. I just need some more reps under my belt. But with you, with what you're doing too, think about a guy like Howard Stern. There's so many people out there that are able to speak their minds because of him being able to say what he said all those years ago and then developing as an interviewer along the process. So what you're doing, not only are you giving your opinions about what's going on in Philly in a way that some people will love and other people will push back against and not like what you're saying, but you have the courage to do that. And then talking to athletes and talking to guys who are used to getting their ego stroked, but also they have to put on their big boy pants sometimes and deal with the criticisms. So think about your experience growing up. It could either be back in, you mentioned your middle and high school years. It could be the Eagles teams, guys that you follow in the Sixers. If there was one guy, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be a Philly guy, one guy that you could interview that you looked up to, who would it be? And what would be the first question that you would ask to that person?
That's a good one. The reason that's challenging is I've been blessed enough to meet a lot of people. So that's good. But as far as the interview goes, the most interesting one for me would probably be Dr. J, because one, I'm kind of mad at him for what he did to Joel Embiid last year, kind of backstabbed him on his MVP race. But the reason would be is because Dr. J was a person who was looked upon at the time as the coolest individual on the planet. And you fast forward to this day, and whenever he walks into the room, he's still considered the coolest individual on the planet. And you ask Michael Jordan, who he looked up to, and it's him. And still, like, when I've taken pictures with him and I've met him, but I've never interviewed him. And to be able to really dig into, like, the lifestyle of, like, why Dr. J is still, like, that guy all these years later. What is it about that natural swag to where people still gravitate him to the way that he did? And he had a divorce, finds another wife, still has like a whole other situation with a new family. And I'm not saying that that's the best thing ever. It's like, there's never people who don't want to be around that guy. What is it about him to where people gravitate to him more than almost anybody? And that part is really fascinating to me, because I don't think that's something, he might not even be able to articulate it, but maybe I can sense it from having more interaction with him. Why is this guy always considered the coolest guy? Despite there's a bunch of Allen Iversons at the game, all these people, and there's still people that go, the coolest guy is that guy.
Dr. J.
Dr. J, yeah.
Love it. Interestingly enough, he was my father's favorite basketball player of all time. My girlfriend's father's favorite basketball player of all time. And there was just something about him. He just had that. He had that swag. Is basketball your favorite sport? Would you say that's the one?
Yeah. I'd say that's my favorite. I mean, I watch them all. Football's the biggest in the city, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, basketball's my favorite. Yeah.
Give me a couple guys in your top 5 of all time.
LeBron's one.
He's one. All right. That's what I was gonna go with. All right, he's number one.
Yeah, LeBron's one, Jordan's two, Kareem's three. Four. I think actually Curry's down the top 5. Now I really think so. And Magic. That's my top 5. I know people be upset that Kobe's not in there. What Curry did. I try to look beyond just the basketball part. So LeBron came along. Kobe actually made it harder for LeBron in a way. So Kobe comes out of high school and goes on the prom with Brandon, all that stuff. Yeah. And it doesn't happen right away, but he succeeds. And then here comes LeBron. And the amount, right when everybody has a phone that has a camera, like imagine Michael Jordan after that game 6, they're down 3-2 in the series. And he then, after that game 5, I should say, they're down in the series 3-2. And then he drives from New York to Atlantic City and stays out all night gambling and then comes back. And no one knew about it till after the fact. Imagine that during LeBron James' era. There's so many. He's down 3-2 in the series. What's he doing? Spending all night in the casino.
You would be talking about it the next day. You would absolutely be talking about it the next day.
Talking about it, it'd be so much. So the amount of scrutiny in which it was harder for LeBron. That's why I rank him ahead. It was harder for LeBron. It just was. Michael Jordan was able to do a lot of things like it all comes out later. Juanita Jordan hires the private investigator and he's running around with all these women and stuff like that. LeBron's been completely scandal-free when everyone in the world's looking for the scandal. You know how hard that must be when you have that much money, that much power, and that many people around you and be completely scandal-free in a world where the world changed so much. They were looking like Derek Jeter even. Derek Jeter, there was a night where at the Mets where there was a violence at a club and everybody got on Carlos Beltran and Jose Reyes for being at that club. And it hit New York media, it was all over the place. Derek Jeter was at that club and no one wrote it. But look, he was at the same club the same night with those same Mets players. And as the fan is talking about how those guys are immature and they shouldn't have been out all night long, Jeter was there and no one wrote it because New York loves Jeter. Meanwhile, there are now people who are millionaires right now and their main job is hating on LeBron James. They're millionaires because they don't like LeBron James. There was no one out there who made money off of hating Jordan, hardly anyone. There are people, there's now a cottage industry, lucrative, on hating a person. That never existed with Michael Jordan. It's just a totally different situation. And that to me is why it's like, that shouldn't happen. That shouldn't exist. Like all those guys should send a percentage of their checks to LeBron every 2 weeks when the direct deposit hits, because that's the only reason they're famous. And it's like, that just didn't happen with Jordan. It was harder for LeBron. That's why I haven't won.
It's so interesting too. You hear stories about Mickey Mantle in the 50s and being out after games and he's with 3 women and he's drinking a scotch with the reporters and nobody talked about that. There was this unwritten rule, but the way society has become now, you see anyone and people are becoming Instagram famous because they're posting that stuff up there. So you put you put James over Jordan because of the way the world is, not just pure basketball talent. You're saying he had to deal with so much more and had Jordan, because Jordan he got salty quick. He would, he definitely had that personality where he would have like punched somebody in the face if they had a camera next to him. Right. So because of that, so I'll use that to segue into Steph Curry. You mentioned what these guys have done to change the game. Steph Curry, he has absolutely changed the game. He's made these little white kids think that they can make the NBA just by shooting threes. He's like what he's done to the game has definitely revolutionized it. So you're saying that he has been a very positive impact on the game. His being incorporated into NBA basketball has definitely changed it, and it's been in a positive way.
Yeah, it's changed it completely. Also, another guy who's been completely scandal free.
Right.
And despite the fact that, and the other part is he's unique in that he was a rich kid growing up and had every reason to not work as hard. Yet he still ends up, because actually, I guess the greatest gift God gave him was he wasn't tall growing up. And he was so thin that he was somehow bypassed, despite the fact that the guy literally had it in his genes to be that guy. His dad, up until that point, was arguably had been the best shooter we'd ever seen. And then he comes along and he's so much better. And what's crazy is it's going to take a long time to duplicate what he did. And also, he's a different kind of genetic freak, in that people notice it about LeBron James, because it's like, look how big he is. Look at how fast he is at that size and stuff. How many jump shots at this point in his mid-30s do you think that Steph Curry has in his legs? Millions, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That shot's not flat. He still has lift on it. You know how many people at his age can't shoot anymore because the legs go? He runs around all those screens. He's going deep in the playoffs all these times now, and yet still he's a different kind of genetic freak. He's just as much of a physical freak as LeBron is. It just looks completely different, and you would never know. You look at him at a grocery store, he's just a 6'3", so he's a semi-tall guy at the Acme.
Yeah.
But the fact that on that, like at this point, Ray Allen, when Ray Allen had that amount of miles on his legs, he was a role player. He wasn't the finals MVP. He was just a guy who needed help to bring stuff along. For him still be the focal point after this long, that guy's a different kind of genetic freak that just looks different than anyone we've ever seen.
Curry's the guy. He's in the Acme, and the little old lady is like, "Can you grab me the pinto beans from the top shelf?
Right.
I can't reach them right now."
Right.
With the idea of what he has done to change the game, it's one of those things that I believe that he has done so much good for basketball. It's brought back a fan base that went away for many years, right? It was like the Latrell Sprewell thing. When that happened and there was a fight in the stands, that set basketball back, and it was like this, I don't know, it just had a different feel about it. But what Steph did is he brought this, and he's another guy that the Knicks passed on him. He come into Davidson in whatever year that was, and the Knicks had like the third draft pick, and Curry went 8 or something, or 7 from ridiculous. David. Absolutely ridiculous. There's a lot of trauma there if you haven't realized that. All right, so before we go, I have 2 quick questions for you. I know I want to respect your time. The first question is, tell me a time that you witnessed a sport. It was either a sporting event that you saw in person, that you watched, whatever, that watching this basically gave you renewed sense in humanity. Like you saw something that happened on a field, on a court, that you're like, you know what? I want to be a better man because I just witnessed this sporting thing happen here.
Well, when I was a kid, the player actually just passed away this week as we taped this, actually. 92 Olympics, the runner that tore his hamstring on the track, and his dad ended up being on and helped him across the finish line. That one was huge for me right away.
Yeah.
He actually just passed away this week. The father who helped him across the finish line back then. That one was big because you recognize sometimes I think a lot of people, when they watch sports, they forget that pro athletes are people. Like there's sometimes the way they talk about them, they forget that they're people. Like I have a rule that if I say it on social media or I say it on the air, I would say it to a person's face, and I would. It might be uncomfortable for that person, wouldn't be uncomfortable for me, but I would. Most people do not follow that. So that's kind of that reminder. And then another time was when LeBron won the Cleveland title, and he just started crying with Kevin Love, and he just started hugging Kevin Love. The reason that was so big was I live in Bordentown, lived in Bordentown for a long time, love Bordentown, from Pennsauken. I love where I grew up. I love everything about it. And it was more like, for me, where that was hitting me, I think he was crying sort of like, we did it for where I grew up. And I would love to one day succeed enough to where I could do anything close to that for where I grew up. And I think that was the one that hit me so big for that reason, because like Michael Jordan's not from Chicago. Like if he was playing for the Hornets and he was from there, it would hit me different.
Right.
When a guy does something for their hometown, really in any way, like had Kobe done all that for the Sixers, are you kidding me? Like that kind of thing. So him going back to where he's from, and the Warriors being like, that was still a David versus Goliath situation, because that Warriors team had won they had broke the record for games. They had 70-some wins, and they're the greatest team ever. And then they're up 3-1 in the series and lose. Like, are you kidding me? Like, and lose that way. And then Cleveland, who's been starving in every sport, like the poor Browns fans, and now the Guardians fans, they don't win. They never win. Obviously, they had never won. And then to get that, the way I looked at it was like, wow, that's what someone could possibly do on a different scale for their hometown. Give them something that they've never had. And I would love to do that one day.
Love it. On your way, my man. My last question is, if someone's listening to this episode and they get a lot of value off of everything you said so far, Tyrone, and they could press pause, and there's one thing that they can do right now that by doing this one thing, it could really change their future, change the trajectory of their life by this one thing. What would that one thing be?
They have to figure out who they are. I think there are a lot of people out there, and this is another way where I've been very lucky and very blessed to be able to be an individual. Now, that's caused issues because being generic is easier, and being generic will quote unquote sell, but you might not be happy being generic. And I don't think anyone is actually truly generic. I think sometimes people will dumb themselves down or dilute themselves in order to be that way. And if you're happy where you are, then keep on being generic. But if you're not happy where you are, I think the first thing you have to do is figure out who the heck you are, and then you can figure everything else out. Do I have the right people around me? Do I have the right spouse? Do I have the right friends? Do I have the right job? Do I have the right coworkers? Everything. You can evaluate everything else, but you can't evaluate any of that until you know yourself first. And I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of people who are much older than me, obviously ones younger than me, who don't know who they are. Therefore, they can't then decide their own destiny or who they want to be around because they don't know who they are. And I see it in marriages. I see it absolutely at work where it's not necessarily a fault situation. That wife, that husband's with somebody who they thought they should be with because they thought they were X. And then they come out and find out that they're Y. And that person is no longer compatible with what you want to be or who you want to be. And you have the wrong everything. And I think that's the number one thing. And the one thing I had going for me all along was a sense of self. I've had different anxieties, hard times, a bunch of other stuff, but I kind of was always an expert on being Tyrone Johnson. I don't mean to be, I'm saying I know who I am. Therefore, I can figure out, does that person make sense around me? You don't know that if you don't know who you are. And I think when I finally started to break through was when I decided to just no longer fake it for people who were never going to accept me anyway. I'm going to win as me, or I'm going to lose as me, because trying to dilute myself to hope that a person who was going to be afraid of me, quote unquote, will suddenly not be afraid of me, that was never going to work. And it helped me become a better husband. It helped me be a better sibling and everything else, because here is who I am. I'm not saying everyone's going to like it, but here is who it is, and it's going to be consistent because I'm comfortable. And I think part of sometimes the person who's all over the place is because this day they're cool. This day they're the nerd. This day they're this. Just who are you? And just be that.
That's great advice. Things that I'll absolutely share that with my kids and people that are listening to the podcast. That is the brilliant gems of wisdom right there, my man. I really appreciate this. It's funny. There's so many things that you brought up today, Tyrone. I want to go deeper into like 10 different things that you talked about.
We'll do it again. We'll do part two.
Absolutely. I'd be honored to do part two. Before I give you an opportunity to share where we can find you, text Barkley and tell him I'm thinking about him. I'd love to have him on as a guest, even if he doesn't get back for 6 hours.
I will.
But how can we find you, Tyrone?
You can find me on social media, on Twitter at Ty Johnson News, and every day 2 to 6 on 97.5 The Fanatic on the best show ever. And it's also simulcast on NBC Sports Philadelphia. So you can find us there. And I appreciate each and every person out there that listens and watches, and I appreciate you so much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure, man. All right, so what's Eagles' final record this year? What are they going to? They're 4-0 right now.
They're good now. 12-5.
12-5. All right.
They're not going to play anybody last week.
Jalen Hurts is so much better than I thought he was going to be. It's really frustrating for me as a Giants fan watching how good he is right now, but I'm happy for you, and I'm happy for your career and to watch this journey. We'll definitely do part two. Make sure you check out our sponsors, FTR Apparel, for all things building men. Become Stronger Industries for handmade steel maces, hammers, and other badass equipment. The Chop Club for Men. Men, do you want to learn how to master your health in 1 year or less without sacrificing work or family time? You got to get in on the chops by visiting www.chopclubformen.com for more information. Also, Check out the foundation, our website, buildingmen.io. We have a virtual coaching group for young men in middle school and in high school that will be starting shortly. So reach out to us if you have any questions. Go one step further than you thought you could go. We'll see you next time on Building Men.